Eggs. Boy, do I love a good frittata. But what if they killed people, is what I would say if I lived a few centuries ago, where things were even stranger than they are today if possible. Now, today's story is one of those that make you say, that can be right. Oh, but it is. It's about eggs, it's about ships sinking eggs, and a strange historical record that led me down a rabbit hole I didn't even know existed until last week. My name is Gaia, but I'm not that Gaia, and this is the story of the time witches used eggs to cause shipwrecks. Now, this story starts in 1583. In the small town of King's Lynn, a woman by the name of Mother Gabley is accused of a terrible crime: boiling eggs. I know, I don't like them either like that. But in this case, the accusation goes way beyond culinary differences taken too far. Mother Gabley here is actually being accused of sinking a ship returning from Spain using nothing more than a pail full of water and a bunch of eggs. Crazy, right? And she did that from a distance too. Mother got range. She was in King's Lynn, right, in Norfolk, but the ship sank west of Wells next the sea, which is another British town with a questionable name almost 27 miles away from there. The incident took the lives of 14 sailors in total, and Mother Gabley was actually accused of being the culprit. We actually don't know much about her, almost nothing in fact, so we don't really know why she of all people was accused. By the name we can assume that she was most likely an older woman and one of those healers or wise women that populated Europe during those times. The fact that she lived in King's Lynn and was accused of something happening almost 30 miles away suggests that she was fairly well known in the local cunning folk scene, and who knows, maybe she even had some prior connection to the ship that got lost in time. What we do know, however, is that the court of public opinion was very harsh on this lady, and the parish register of Wells next the sea paints a very clear picture of her involvement in the shipwreck. In the burial records from March 1583, a note about the tragedy reads as follows: perished upon the west coast coming from Spain, Richard Waller, Christian Dodd, John Bunting, William Craven, George Page, Gregory Baxter, Christian Baxter, Thomas Eyre, Henry Goldsmith, Walter Marshall, Robert Archer, Oliver Cobb, William Barrett, and Richard Dye, whose deaths were brought to pass by the detestable working of an execrable witch of King's Lynn whose name was Mother Gabley, by the boiling, or rather labouring, of certain eggs in a pail full of cold water. Now, what's being described here is actually an example of sympathetic magic, which is basically a type of ritual practice that uses objects resembling or representing what you want to affect, believing that they are connected through the laws of sympathy. In this case, Mother Gabley supposedly, possibly, allegedly, wanted to cause a storm at sea and give a hard time to the sailors, right? So she simulated one by labouring, that is, by agitating the water in the pail to imitate the motion of the sea, and by using eggs to represent the boats that she wanted gone. Now, examples of these types of sympathetic ship sinking, if you will, have been recorded all over Europe during the witch trials, but depending on the location, different objects have been used to mimic the boats. The Scottish and the Irish, for instance, often use wooden bowls. The Scandinavians preferred seashells. There's records of cases where feathers were used, sometimes pieces of wood, and sometimes even mussels. Whatever it was easiest to come by, I guess, and in the case of Mother Gabley, she supposedly chose eggs to do the deed. As a result of this accusation, she became the first person condemned in Norfolk since the 1563 Act Against Conjurations, Enchantments and Witchcraft, which was actually passed early on in the reign of Elizabeth I. And in comparison to the previous laws against witchcraft, it was considered very merciful. For a while, the number of executions had dropped and people were more likely sent to prison, which still sucks, don't get me wrong. If I was sent to jail for making an omelette, I'd be pissed, but better that than the gallows, I guess. Still, since Mother Gabley was accused of killing 14 people, this quote-unquote merciful law didn't really help her much, so soon after the event, Girly Pop was found guilty of causing death by eggs. Mother Gabley was sentenced to death by hanging, and this sentence was likely carried out in King's Lynn's Tuesday Marketplace, which still exists today. There's a market there, on Tuesday. Now, despite the lack of details, the case of Mother Gabley is still considered the most famous when it comes to egg-related shipwrecks, but that doesn't mean that it was the only one. One can say that people were scrambling to find the culprit. No, but for real, at the time many people fully believed in witches' ability to control and affect the weather. Ever since the Middle Ages, talks of storm raising and weather making were so common that in certain regions witches with this ability had a specific name. They were called Tempestari, and these were members of the community that were both feared and respected. A Tempestarius was believed to have the ability to control the weather for better or for worse, so they were both seen as an asset to save the crops or as a threat against them. In Northern Europe especially, there are also records of witches using weather powers against enemies. In Iceland, they employed storm raising to defend the land from the pirates, while in Swedish folklore there is also a story about a witch using eggs to sink the ship of an invader. Good for her. This legend has also been retroactively associated to a real-life event that took place in 1361. The Danish king Valdemar IV invaded the Swedish island of Gotland and sacked the town of Visby after a devastating battle. To avoid further pillaging, the king demanded 3 barrels of gold from the villagers, and the villagers obliged, so the king set sail once again with the treasure. Now, according to the legend, a local sorceress took it upon herself to seek vengeance against the king, so she took a pail, filled it with water, then put the eggs in the water and started to stir. As a result, Valdemar's ship sank and the treasure was forever lost, and as it turns out, this is actually historically accurate. A ship in his fleet did sink, and people are still looking for the treasure to this day. In 2011, they actually found a medieval wreck near Gotland, but no treasure was ever recovered to my knowledge, so at least for now the search still continues. Point is that these storm-raising witches might have been feared, despised even, but folklore also shows that these powers were also considered useful sometimes, both for defense or retaliation. When the witch trials came along though, this perceived moral greyness disappeared altogether. In the Middle Ages, tempestari could do good and could do bad, but during the witch hunts, witches were considered evil, so anything that these people did or were believed to be doing, such as storm raising for instance, was considered evil by default. The story of Mother Gably was the result of centuries worth of this type of thinking, and it wasn't the only one. Over in Ireland, for instance, a similar tale was recorded by school children in the 1930s. The story is set in Mogoggin's Corner in Yo. Yo? I think it's Yo. I would pronounce it Yugo, but I'm pretty sure it's Yo, like yolk without the K. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So according to this legend, once upon a time there lived a witch who practiced magic. One day she put 3 eggs in a pan. 1 egg hopped out and she said 1 man gone. Then the second hopped out and she said 2 men gone. Then the third one hopped out as well and she said 3 men gone. And at this point people started to get nervous, they started to get shifty. Is she making lunch? Is she killing people? We don't know, and that's a problem. Sure enough, that day 3 men drowned at sea and she was blamed for it. As a punishment, she was banished in a ball of cotton wool and her house was eventually blown away by the storm. Now, this is obviously just a story, right? Just a local legend coming from the rich folklore of the region, but like the tale of the Swedish sorceress, legends like this do tell us something about reality. First, that stories like that of Mother Gably were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a larger framework of superstitions that span across different ages and different regions. Second, that in the eyes of many, eggs were not just a food, but rather a powerful tool with magical properties, a notion that, as it turns out, is much more widespread than one may think. Now, using edible goods in spiritual and or magical practices is nothing new in the slightest. In fact, people have been doing that since the beginning of time all over the world. After all, people tend to use materials that are easy to find. Think of leaves, for instance, or, animal parts, but eggs in particular have always been a popular ingredient in this type of practices. Different beliefs involve using eggs as talismans against the evil eye. In some magical traditions, eggs are important ingredients for potions or spells, and historically many cultures all over the world have used eggs in rituals associated to the afterlife or even as offerings for the dead. Eggs are so popular not only because they're fairly easy to come by, but also because they have a strong symbolic significance. They can represent the circle of life, for instance, or be a symbol of rebirth, hope, fertility, or even a potential that is yet to be realized. Eggs are versatile both in the kitchen and in symbolism, so it's no surprise that they're used in so many ways. The most popular egg-related practice, however, is probably something called ovomancy, which is a form of food divination that involves predicting the future or interpreting omens from the shape of an egg white dropped in boiling water. Now, in the West, this practice started to be more documented around the time the witch hunts and the witch trials were making the rounds, so think about early 15th century maybe. A couple of centuries later, however, ovomancy would also be mentioned during the Salem witch trials of all places. Rumor has it that Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, which were 2 of the main accusers of the trials, were actually seen practicing ovomancy right before the whole ordeal even began. At the time, Betty was 9 and Abigail was 11, so they were kids. They were cousins and they were bored because of course they were, so they decided to play some fortune-telling game to kill the time. They dropped an egg white in a glass to practice husband calling, which was basically a game to predict who their future husband would be, except instead of seeing marriage, the egg white turned into a coffin, which was not a good sign as you can imagine. This event essentially jump-started the whole mess because soon after the children started having symptoms and the game was framed as the incident opening the door to Satan as they described it at the time. Because sure, blame the egg. As I mentioned before, since the beginning of the witch hunts, cases of ovomancy and other egg-related practices started to get documented more and more often, especially in relation to witchcraft. This is because at the time, anything that was not strictly Christian was considered blasphemous and potentially demonic by default. Truth of the matter though, these games and practices have existed for forever, and ovomancy is actually considered as one of the oldest and most common forms of divination all over the world. From Jamaica to Mexico to South Korea to Scotland to Northern Europe, people believed, and in some cases they still do to this day, that eggs could predict the success of a marriage, for instance, the outcome of childbirth, the gender of a baby, an untimely death, and even the fate of your travels, which is especially ironic considering that women like Mother Gabley were accused of actively sinking ships using eggs. It's almost like an egg-fulfilling prophecy if you think about it. It's actually believed that ovomancy might date all the way back to ancient Greece, but in ancient Rome, other forms of egg divination were recorded just as well. There is actually a very interesting episode documented by Pliny the Elder and about Livia Drusilla. Now, for context, Livia Drusilla was the first empress of Rome. She was the wife of Augustus, the guy that literally founded the Roman Empire, and at the time of this event, Livia Drusilla was pregnant with Tiberius, which will later become the second emperor of Rome. Livia wanted to know the gender of the baby, so she took an egg, put it in between her breasts to keep it warm, and when it hatched, the chick was a boy, which was a sign that the baby was going to be a boy as well. And it was. The technique used by Livia Drusilla was not the only one reported throughout history. There's plenty of other reported ways that have been used to predict the health, the gender, or even the number of babies to be born. Like these eggs were in a lot of pressure to deliver, talk about putting all your eggs in one basket if you will. These eggs were going through it even before reaching the pan, so it's pretty clear that they had a huge symbolic significance in magical and cultural practices all over the world. Oh, but it doesn't end there. Oh no, especially when it comes to egg-related shipwrecks. Did you think I was done with that, did you? Haha, think again, my little eggnog. A widespread folk belief actually advises people to always break eggshells so that witches cannot use them to set sail and sink the fishing boats. For the most part, this seems to be a British superstition, but once again, Pliny the Elder makes a reference to it in the 1st century AD, so its origins go way back. The first, let's say, modern record of this superstition instead actually appears in 1584 in Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott. About a century later, it was mentioned once again by Sir Thomas Browne, who wrote a whole book of folk superstition with the sole purpose of debunking them. In the 19th century, Lady Wilde, Oscar Wilde's mother, actually wrote a book about legends and superstitions of Ireland, and she actually mentions eggshells not in relation to witches, but rather in connection to fairies, who seemingly loved to live in eggshells. To prevent the fairies from moving in, Lady Wilde advises to break the shells after use, which is a practice that the Irish immigrants also continued practicing after moving to America. In the 20th century, this superstition was also immortalized in poetry form by Scottish poet Elizabeth Fleming, who wants to never leave unbroken shells in a cup, otherwise witches might use them to set sail and bring misery to the sailors. Now, at this point, it's pretty clear that throughout history, eggs have not only been used in all sorts of ritual practices, but oftentimes they also took the blame for things that, let's face it, they had no business being blamed for. The whole idea that a woman was able to sink a ship using eggs is insane in today's world, or at least it should be, but back then Mother Gabley and who knows how many other women died as a result of these superstitions. I was so fascinated by this story that I just had to talk about it, I guess. But what do you think? Do you have some weird superstitions about eggs where you live? Have you ever sunk a ship using eggs? You can tell me. So, this has been it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I hope you leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, say hi, and that's it.